Okay, so good afternoon. We are all our panelists very happy that you decided to come here and listen to our pre-lunch session on religion and security. My name is Pavol Demeš and I am fellow with the German Marshall Fund. And before I will introduce my panelists and set the rules and stage for the game, I thought that it would be very important for us to understand a little bit the composition of the audience, because we could fine-tune performance based on who you are. So I will just ask 2-3 questions and to you, and then I will introduce the panel. If you could raise your hands, those of you who are from the Western Balkan country, one of the 6, we just need to see. Okay, fine. You are not Western. Okay, now we go. If you want, you are welcome. Okay, Romania, so 6 + 1. Okay, how many of you are from North America? Do we have some Americans here? Okay, perfect. And how many do we have from Asia? Great. Okay, so we have quite well covered continent now. A little more complicated question. How many of you believe that church leaders contribute to harmony and stability in the world? Well, okay, three people. How many of you think that church leaders are more part of difficulty in international relations? Okay, fine. You see that I think that we will need to do a little work here to convince our audience that, but you do not need to be convinced, religion is playing profound role in today's international relations. And I'm very glad that Sonja Licht and all organizing team decided to include topic of religion into this year's 7th edition of Belgrade Security Forum. I've been here from the beginning most of the time, and I always felt that we somehow overlook importance of religion and various religious groups, churches, in international relations, dialogue, harmony, peace. And so this will be first kickoff session, and let's hope, if we do well, together with all of you, that these may become a session which will continue throughout coming years. I'm really honored that panel which I was asked to moderate was composed so cleverly. I don't know whether it was coincidence but also help from above, that we have people who are from 3 continents and of various backgrounds. You have short bios of all but one panelist, because he lives so close from this hotel. He didn't send his photos. I will introduce Robin shortly. But the composition is following. We have practitioners, academics, journalists, and priests on panel, and all of them will get 4 to 5 minutes to frame the issue and introduce their views on how religion and security goes together. And they can take it from any angle of their professional and personal experience. And then I may ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we will open it to your questions, comments. We want to have this lively interplay between the audience and you. So Adnan Kifayat is from the United States. He is currently fellow with the German Marshall Fund. This is not GMF complot. He is from California, and fellow means that he is sort of cooperating with GMF, but he is from Gen Next Foundation, which is dealing with the security radical movements and so on. But he has huge experience also with working with governments, because in the United States they realize that religion plays profound role in foreign policy, international relations. So You will see from his CV in booklet that he served both White House, State Department, and Ministry of Finance, so on, trying to tackle this issue. But currently he's NGO guy, totally open to say what he thinks about the matter. Then we will have Lisbeth Prodromou, who is professor at Fletcher School and is dealing with these also with the topic academically, but also Elizabeth served in governmental groups which are dealing with the matter, so she knows this interplay also from practical point of view. Then we will have pure academic, Dr. Hyun Choi from Seoul, South Korea, who studied in UK but did several study stays in the United States, so he understands the topic not only from the perspective of his home country, but dealt with the topic, studied it, and published numerous articles in the field. So he will be looking at this mostly from academic point of view. Remzi Lani is old-timer with Belgrade Security Forum. Remzi is leading journalist and organizer from Tirana, and executive director of the Albanian Media Institute. So those of you who are from the Balkans know Remzi very well. And I think that Remzi has broad expertise not only from Albania, where he lives, but also from the Western Balkans and Europe, because he travels and is on demand to talk at all kinds of meetings, conferences. Last but not least, so you will find images of all these four guys from my panel, but if you want to have a picture of Robin, you need to have selfie with him after, because Robin is not in brochure, but Robin knows this town best of all of us, because Robin is chaplain from 2004, where he came from England to this town and is active priest here in Belgrade. So his perspective will be of particular importance, and Robin just told me, and you can Google it as well, that he travels as chaplain and priest also to other countries and cities in the Western Balkans, so his perspective is broader than Belgrade. So I am particularly happy, Robin, that we will have your perspective as well. So with this brief introduction of panel, I would like to ask all of you to have your 4, max 5 minutes to frame the issues, and we'll come as soon as possible then to the audience, which I'm sure will have plenty questions, because wisdom of this panel is quite high. So, Adnan, if I may ask you to kick off this discussion with your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for choosing this breakout. I'm partial, but I think it's the most important one. I wanted to just make a few comments. One is, I was in government for a period of time, both under the Bush administration in Washington as well as the Obama administration. And one of the things I came away with thinking about religion and the role of religious leaders in public policy was, it's dangerous to have government involved in this space, in part because it's hard to keep policymakers from picking and choosing which religious leaders they like and which ones they don't. It's very easy to say that one's bad because that one's violent. Other than that, it becomes really messy. And so I'd always had a sort of uncomfortable relationship with this issue. That notwithstanding, I worked on religion and politics for a long time in Washington. And what I've learned is that the private sector is really, and the non-governmental sector is really very well positioned to engage in this space and engage in a much more full way. So with that sort of context and my approach in mind, and the title of this conversation is Perceptions and Misunderstandings. And I want to take a view of the target audience from my vantage point, which is I will just say Muslim millennials, which is the topic that I worked on the most. Youth that are at risk of radicalization by groups like Al-Qaeda and now ISIS, and the sort of ideologies of violent extremism that those organizations promote. And what I like to say is perceptions really are so critical, because how Muslim youth look at themselves and how they perceive themselves through the lens of social media, popular media around them is critical to this fight. How other people misunderstand or understand Muslim youth is also critical. And so the interplay on this specific demographic, and I'm being very general, and we'll get into the conversations, I think, later on, but it's essential. And what I've seen is the more we deepen the focus on religious text, religion itself, the worse the problem becomes. And that may be a little controversial, but getting into in religious interpretations touches a sort of nerve in people that tends, more often than not, that tends to sort of close them up, and it tends to feed certain narratives that people are pushing out there. So a big part of the work that I've been involved in is about changing the conversation online. Because I do feel like it's fundamentally, when we talk about radicalization and we talk about recruitment to violent causes, I think it's in large part a failure of communications and a failure of modern communications to get the right stories and the right information out there. We were at breakfast this morning, and I learned about how the Pope visited Albania as his first visit overseas after becoming Pope. I learned about other religious leaders visiting the Vatican. There are amazing stories about Muslim leaders, community leaders, not religious Muslim leaders, but just people who are leaders in their communities doing amazing things, but those stories aren't getting out there. And so a big part of my focus has been to get good stories, I'll say good, because we can make value judgments, but getting good, positive narratives out there to counter the bad narratives. And it's an uphill battle, but it's totally winnable, because in this day and age, I'll leave this final thought, in this day and age, if we can sell underwear online and use advertising and marketing to present positive ideas, we can definitely sell nonviolence and keep young people from being recruited, because it's all about messaging, it's all about communications, and we have the tools to be able to do that. And I'd like to get into it a little bit later in the Q&A.
Excellent. So, Elizabeth.
Okay. First, thank you, Pavol, for the great introduction. And also, this is my first time in Serbia, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Sonja Licht and everybody who worked to make this an extraordinary experience. It's just been from soup to nuts, as they say, perfection. So thank you very much for welcoming us here. I thought a lot about the title of our panel, and also well aware of the fact that I guess this is a kind of experiment in having a panel that actually deals with religion at the Security Forum. I wanted to talk a little bit about why we're here, and then how we think about this topic, and then say some things about the work that I'm doing. And in terms of why we're here, I think should be self-evident, but we're all here because we realize that religion is everywhere in the world around us, and that the so-called late modern or postmodern condition is a reality in which religion is present at 10,000 feet at the policymaking level, in the weeds at the grassroots level, in the public sphere, and also in the private sphere. And I think we're also here, given this panel, because we want to rethink the relationship, the nature of the relationship between religion and security. And I think what most importantly, most specifically for us, that I think is the problematic at hand is coming to terms with how it is that religion plays a very active role in the conceptualization of security, in the provision of security, and ultimately in the overall metrics of security, either positive or negative. Now, having said this, and again, this may be self-evident, I think the fact we're even having this conversation, which is based on these, kind of empirical observation, means that we're basically living through what Thomas Kuhn would call a paradigm shift, what I think is helpful for us to think about as an epistemic revolution. And what do I mean by that? I mean simply that we are, all of us, living, whether we are conscious of it or not, through a kind of revolution in the knowledge systems that we bring to bear in thinking about the role of religion in contemporary international relations, and more specifically in terms of the nexus between religion and security. And the old knowledge frameworks, which for academics can be summarized in terms of the secularization thesis or modernization theory, if you will, but the old knowledge systems regarding how we think about the religion security nexus could be summed up very neatly on a small slip of paper and go something like this: lots of religion equals little security. More specifically, the presence and the participation and the engagement of religious ideas, actors, organizations in the public sphere brings negative returns, and even more specifically, creates enormous problems when it comes to security. That's the old knowledge framework that I think most of us grew up with, although I don't know how to place us all generationally, but that's been the hegemonic knowledge framework that, whether actively or passively, deliberately or subconsciously, we have all absorbed, and I would submit, experienced in our professional lives. And in terms of the professional spaces that I know best, which is the academic space, but also I served for 8 years on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I also, under both the Bush and the Obama administrations, and then also in an advisory capacity to Secretaries Clinton and Kerry on religion and U.S. foreign policy. In terms of those academic and policy environments, my experience is that old knowledge regime is not only unhelpful in understanding the empirical reality around us, but also has been quite damaging and allow us to see the range of possibilities by which religion engages with, contributes to, impedes, but is part of the definition and the provision of security in our world. And so just to give you a couple of concrete examples of work that I'm doing now that I think is speaks to the things that I have been discussing. First is a project that began as a kind of NATO dialogue project, but has expanded into a project that has support from the Carnegie Foundation, and that's a project on migration, religion, and security in Europe and Eurasia. And that project has been designed to look at the way in which the migration phenomenon, and I use the term phenomenon rather than crisis, because as our panelists last night, I think, brilliantly pointed out, Europe's, or so-called self-styled core Europe's preoccupation with the migration crisis has meant that they have long ignored the phenomenon of mixed migration across the Mediterranean from 3 continents, Africa, Europe, and Asia. But this project is meant to look at the way in which the migration phenomenon is recalibrating the relationship between religion and security. And some of the most interesting findings for us thus far are, number one, that in thinking about religion as either a push factor or a factor in how Europe has responded to migration, we see, number one, that we need a far more nuanced understanding of security that encompasses state security, non-traditional security, and also human security, and that religion is engaged and part of all 3 of those security domains intersectionally. Number two, despite the dominance and predominance of religion in political party platforms, the media, and policy discourse in Europe when it comes to thinking about migration flows, mixed migration, refugees, asylum seekers, the fact of the matter is religion is not a primary push factor in these migration flows, which forces us to think about, well, why then religion is so much part of the discourse. And one of our suggestive findings is that the phenomenon of migration is producing a dramatic religious pluralization of Europe. And it's forcing Europe to, and European policymakers and publics to think about what secularity means in Europe, in a Europe that is religiously pluralized, and in a Europe where freedom of conscience, belief, and religion should presumably mean a level of comfort with religious diversity. But in fact, that's certainly not the case. So that's the first project. The second project is an initiative supported by the Luce Foundation on religious literacy and international relations at the Fletcher School. And what we're trying to do in this, we're have a conference. In fact, Sonia is coming to the conference, I'm happy to say, is to look at what are the necessary building blocks and rubrics regarding religion that are useful for IR scholars and practitioners in thinking about security in our world today. What basic knowledge about religion and what religious knowledge is useful for IR scholar practitioners, and also for religious practitioners engaged in international relations in thinking about this religion security nexus. So I'll leave it there. That's the research, and I think speaks again to why we're all here.
So, we are moving to a little bit further to your country.
Yeah. Today I'd like to approach the religious issues from a more academic perspective. So when we address some religious hatred and violence, we often suggest some kind of good policies like religious tolerance and mutual understanding, right? And we assume that such a good policies can contribute to lessen the degree of hatred and conflict. However, I want to point out that in some parts of the world, such a good policies can be bad politics from politicians' perspective, especially non-democratic leaders. So I don't want to say that. I'm not saying that such good policies are bad. We all know that they are good. However, we need to understand the logic of politics in the process of radicalization of a religious identity. So the key idea and the key point I want to suggest today is religious hatred and also religious violence are often provoked by secular leaders and political elites to gain, maintain, and strengthen their hold on political power. And I believe this is especially true in non-democratic countries such as Iraq, Syria, Eritrea, and also today's Myanmar, and also even Islamic State, although Islamic State is not really a state. So if we see the logic of a dictatorship in those countries or authoritarian rule, those countries are quite different from democratic countries. So their power is based on the support of a few number of elites. And the leaders of those countries provide some benefit and privileges in the form of money and political offices, so to maintain their power in their office. So they are provided mostly in the form of private goods instead of public goods. So in those kind of regime, it is important to exclude the majority of the population from joining the ruling coalition, because the beneficiaries of those private benefits are few number of elites based on specific ethnic or religious identity. And therefore, I believe the principle, the logic of a dictatorship or the logic of a non-democracy is based on the principle of exclusion and also discrimination. And this is where categorical boundaries such as ethnicity, race, and religion, and also even the birthplace of their parents play significant role, because they are so useful to secular leaders to exclude others from joining the ruling coalition. And this is especially happening in Syria today. In Syria, the ruling coalition and the most important positions in the government and the military, and they are almost monopolized by Alawite faction of the Shia Muslim. And the same process happened in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, where most of the positions are occupied by some factions of the Sunni Muslims in Iraq, mostly from northern part of Iraq, especially from Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit, and therefore, so these identities are used to exclude certain groups of people from leaders' ruling coalition, and this is how politics make religion more salient. And also this is how politics promotes religious hatred. And therefore, I believe that the key question in addressing religious violence and conflict is how to make religion less useful to political leaders, and how we can design political institutions and transform those institutions so those leaders no longer rely on religious appeal to maintain their political power. Thank you.
Excellent, Choi. Remzi, your perspective on the matter of religion security.
Thank you, Pavol. Actually, when Sonia asked me to speak in this panel, I asked the question why, and Sonia said, you know why, because you come from Albania. And what makes Albania interesting? Okay, I'll tell you my story first. I come from a family where my father was an atheist, my mother a Muslim, my wife is a Christian Orthodox, but our daughter Christina is a Catholic. She decided to be a Catholic. And actually this is a sample of Albania, somehow. Albania is a multi-religious country, largely secular. And I think this is an important definition which we have to keep in mind. We have a Muslim Sunni community, Muslim Bektashi, a kind of Shia group, Christian Orthodox and Christian Catholics. An identity of Albanians is not based in religion, it's based in the language. We are Albanian because we speak the same language and some other things, but not because we belong to a religious group. Albanian constitution states clearly government's neutrality on question of religion, belief, and conscience. And we use the term for religion communities, which are equal before the law. And the word community is very important because we don't use the terms majority or minority. The four, despite the figures, have the same position towards the law. But often we are described as a Muslim country, and some people or media who want to be nicer with us say democratic Muslim country. I'm not sure how much democratic we are, but I am very sure how much Muslim we are. And country is largely, as I said, quite largely secular. Muslims, of course, is a majority in terms of figures, but this is not an advantage or a disadvantage. This is just a fact. Defining country in religious terms, Muslim or Catholic, in the case of Albania is counterproductive, problematic, and somehow even dangerous. Why? It goes against of how we define ourselves. It goes against of tradition of religious coexistence, and it breaks a balance which has took centuries and decades to establish. I'm not saying that Albania is a religious paradise, but I think it's an interesting and complex story. In one hand, we never experienced a religious conflict, but on the other hand, we experienced the only atheist state in the world, which was the communist regime of Enver Hoxha, a brutal atheist regime, where churches and mosques were closed and became palace of sports or just stories for potatoes and other things. This is why, having in mind our past, but having in mind also our present, Pope Francis chose Albania as for his first trip to a foreign country, delivering the message that religious harmony, he used actually the term fraternity, is possible. And can happen, can exist. Now we are facing some serious challenges, because what I said is not the whole picture. Our moderate of traditional Balkan, and I say Balkan because Bosnia has had the same model, model of Islam, is under the threat of Wahhabis, is under the threat of Salafist groups who want the Arabization of Albanian Islam. Second, around 200 mosques in Albania are out of the control of the Islamic community. They are built with money coming from Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries. More than 100 Albanians, exactly 114, went to Syria, to jihad, Syria and Iraq, fighting for joining ISIS as foreign fighters. 25 of them were killed. And last November, maybe you have heard, it was in international media, our intelligence service, together with partner services, US and Israel, succeeded to prevent a major terrorist attack during the football match between Albania and Israel. So, suddenly country that lives with the myth of religious tolerance and moderation now faces the emergence of jihadist extremism. And for the first time, we see now the securitization of religion, transforming religion into a security issue. Now, for the first time, we are thinking that we might be a target. Actually, we have been participating very actively in all ISIS anti-terrorist coalitions, sending troops, sending munitions, and everything. And now we are thinking that we might be a target, and religion became, for the first time, a security issue in Albania. The response was, as in other countries, law against foreign fighters, arrest of their recruiters, and Albania is also hosting soon the first regional center for countering violent extremism. But I think the security prism, the security approach is not enough. We need an education approach, because education is poor in many areas in Albania. We need an economy approach, to cut it short, because we are still a country with serious poverty. But we need also a democracy approach. I think the religious extremism is affecting our democracy. We talk for all kinds of populism, but there is also some religious populism. Religious leaders are becoming also populist, and they are on the internet. And religious extremism is bringing a dose of intolerance in the public discourse, even in Albania, and the environment is becoming more intolerant and more poisoned. And the last point, I think we see religion, and also the title of the panel is security. In the case of Albania, it's more religion and stability. Because religious coexistence, for us, is not a luxury, is a pillar of our existence, actually. Not coexistence, but our existence. Because if the balance is broken, I don't think that we can survive. And being a journalist, I think I have to mention a bit media. There are two levels. One is the mainstream media, televisions, newspapers, which are politically correct, who escape the debate, the real issues, they escape the debate, and they follow the line of not playing with the fire, and avoiding any serious debate on these issues. And the second level is the online media, which is full of religious hate speech, with fake news, religious fake news. And we have and there are data now that most of the people who went for jihad are actually recruited in the echo chambers of the internet. And we have to deal with this. And the echo chambers of internet are full of the syndrome of victimization, a philosophy that here in the Balkans we know very well. You play the victim, are full of the alibis of Islamophobia. Of course, there is Islamophobia, but any criticism is very easy classified in the Islamophobia box. And there's also a kind of Gaza Strip mentality that is trying to convince Muslim people that they live in a kind of social occupation and forced isolation. So, Elizabeth mentioned the education and during the breakfast the term literacy. I think it's very important to invest more on what is called religious literacy. And I will stop here. We have to shift, I believe, from a whole government approach to a whole society approach. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Remzi. So, Robin, you heard lay people. Now we are coming to priest. How you see it, both from your perspective, since from 2004 you live in Belgrade, you see all these dilemmas, changes, but surely you are following also more global situation when it comes to religion and its role in societal development and international relations. Please.
Thank you. When I started thinking about what I would say this afternoon, I was looking at the brief talking about extremism and radicalization, which are interesting words to compare with being an Anglican. An extreme radical Anglican arguing perhaps over how many tea bags to use to make the tea. The Church of England does have a rather old-fashioned kind of image about it when it comes to these kind of things. But I think there is perhaps a value in that as well, that being seen as an institution which is not likely to go out and radicalize people actually gives us a much louder voice sometimes, which is paid much more attention to, perhaps by community leaders, by governmental leaders, things like that. I'm actually very fortunate in speaking last, I think, because I've been able to hear other ideas being put forward, and I was very pleased to see that they match very well the notes that I'd already made. I think one thing that's come up is the idea of how a religious community can have a positive effect within governmental systems. And I think the paradox here is that the Church of England as a state church, as an established church within the system, actually is more free to speak out against the system and be free from that system than many other religious communities. It's an odd way of being freed by being made a part of the establishment, but I think that is actually true. And the Church of England, I think, especially in the 1980s, developed a very strong voice in criticising the sitting government at the time. In terms of international relations, for example, at the end of the Falklands War, the Archbishop of Canterbury refused to have a celebratory service and instead insisted on having a service of reconciliation and penitence. There were a couple of very important Church of England reports, Faith in the City and Faith in the Countryside, which flayed the government for their policies, which the Church saw as creating poverty. And so the Church and any religious community does have the ability to speak out within those systems. And because of our relationship with the state, I think the Church of England has perhaps more possibilities than many other. And in that role as well, I think the Church is able to speak out against radicalization, against extremism, against all of these things which clearly are so much a problem of religion in terms of security. The other thing that I very much wanted to talk about, and which came out, I think, in what a couple of people have said already, is the notion of education and of religious literacy. I noticed this at a very basic level when I'm preparing children for confirmation. The number of kids who do not know that there are 4 Gospels in the Bible, which I find absolutely, how can you not know that? It's just sort of, it's standard common knowledge that you learn at school, not anymore. And somehow religious language, the language of faith, has fallen out of public discourse. People don't understand religious terminology. Something else which I find very distressing, I have many times had to correct people who say to me, oh, well, he's Catholic, that's a different religion. And the Orthodox, good grief. They're from another planet, probably. We need to combat, we need to educate, we need to teach people literacy about our own faith, and we need to encourage people to understand other faiths as well. And that's, I would see, as a very practical thing. All religious communities can do this. We can reach out to one another. We can show people that, yes, the person who is a Muslim, that doesn't mean they're a horrible person. They're just a person. And that sense of bringing communities together, sorry, Hindu. That sense of bringing people together, bringing communities together, I think is vitally important. And I think this is how we combat radicalization and extremism from the grassroots level. We start by inviting people in for that Anglican cup of tea with 2 or 3 tea bags, but we actually make a contact. We speak to people. And that, it seems to me, is the essential thing, that we have the top-down approach, but also we have to start at that very basic level. And unless we do that, we miss out on a huge amount. And I think that sense of relearning our own faith, because I'm sure it's not just the Church of England and the British system where the language of faith has disappeared, for each religious community to relearn their own faith, to learn the faith of other communities, and to learn that at heart, the essential message of all of our faiths is a message of peace and reconciliation. If we can only continue to spread that kind of message, and that, I think, is one of the great ways that we would combat radicalization and extremism. So I think, drawing from what everybody said, that sense of living in a multi-faith community, because that's what you have to do. Not sort of using religion as an excuse, but using religion as something to bring us together, even when it's different faiths. I think that is how we should move forward, and how we can ensure security in a very insecure world that we live in today.
Excellent, thank you very much. I will just ask 1 or 2 questions and then open it to your comments and questions, because I think that we got excellent overview of the topic. I wanted to ask you, Adnan, that since within your foundation you are searching also this online media, all of you mentioned communication, education, and how online media are shaping basically discourse. If you could share some sort of practical observations from your work, how online sphere is influencing both radicalization but also de-radicalization of or misusing religion in public discourse.
Sure. Thank you for asking that question. One of the interesting things about Google being the largest search engine and largest advertising entity on the planet is when people search on Google, they're very personal. They're very, they're speaking to a machine, so people naively think that they can be as detailed as they want to be, and they can ask whatever they want. And so it really is an amazing, from a research perspective, it's an amazing insight into how people think and what they are asking and looking for. And what we found at the foundation over the past year, working with Google, working with the incubator at Google, Jigsaw, specifically, is that there are basically about 5 different narrative baskets that are out there that are, in effect, radicalizing, in effect, young people. So we know that there's a target demographic. It's about 24 to 35 years old. We know that it's predominantly male, but not entirely male. And we know the kinds of words that people are looking for. So, they're looking for religious information, textual information. They're also looking for identity information. So the majority of questions are not about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, if I said that correctly. But the majority of questions are about how should I act as a Muslim? I've heard that jihad is my responsibility. What is jihad? Like very sort of kind of fundamental questions. The problem is that those questions are actually being answered. They're being answered by some really bad people, and they're being the calls are being answered by organizations like Al Qaeda and its media arm, or magazines like Dabiq or Inspire, or and on and on. And then they're fanboys, so people who are in the US primarily, but also in Europe and some parts of Asia, but people who are segmenting this information and serving it up, and serving it up at the very keyword search term level. What we found is it's fairly easy to interrupt that cycle. And the cycle is pretty well known. So you ask a question on Twitter or on Google, and if I can connect you with my content, you are more likely to ask for more content that looks like my content. Mm-hmm. That's a basic principle of the internet. Welcome to the modern era. And the reverse is true too. So if I can somehow find your search terms and find what you're looking for and serve up to you or surface to you, either through ads or by search engine optimization, other content, non-violent content or educational content or other information that says, wait, think about it this way, you're actually more likely to ask for more information along those lines. So it's a very, we're kind of in a way binary on the internet. And it's taken a long time since you and I were in government. It's taken a long time for us to learn that. It's kind of obvious now. It wasn't obvious 15 years ago, right after 9/11. We just thought it was all about imams, imams talking to young people and trying to change what the imam was saying. And we're just way beyond that at this point. So.
Great. And one more question to Elizabeth, since both of you served in government, in these committees, councils, what lessons from this type of service or this type of within state, government, non-governmental councils, have they been helpful in the context of US, and whether Trump's administration inherited some of the knowledge from your past?
I have several takeaways. One is I think that the focus on either human rights or security, and in this case, religious freedom, and I would say freedom of, for, from, and in religion, and those are important distinctions. And separating that from security is profoundly unhelpful. You cannot have a stable security environment, whether you're talking about stability of external borders, stability within your borders, or human security, if you don't have the protection of religious freedom of conscience, belief in religion. And the flip side is you cannot have protection of freedom, conscience, belief, and religion if you don't have a stable security order. And in the policy space, and I think this is very important, certainly for Southeastern Europe, but more generally for Europe, the kind of silo effect whereby security policymakers and experts spend time with each other, and human rights and religious freedom people spend time with each other, and never those two communities shall meet, helps to explain why it is that we're having this conversation. And the other piece is, I think, the absolute centrality and irreversibility, unless through violence, of the reality of global religious pluralism. That learning to live in a religiously plural space, whether locally, nationally, or transnationally, is the, I would say, challenge of our world today and this planet. And just a footnote, I would say to Father Robin, as an Orthodox Christian, I can assure you I actually am from this planet, not another planet. So I would urge us to move away from essentializing language, but that's just me.
Okay, audience is also from the same planet. Now, let's open it up for your comments, questions. Just indicate your name and affiliation. You do not need to say your religion, but there you go. Over there, back, but if you want, you can say who you are.
Hi, I'm What's up? Hi, I'm Vlad Galushko from the Open Society Initiative for Europe, and I have a question for Adnan. I think you stepped on a very interesting point about when you talked about serving content to people so that they keep coming back for more. And I think that's where we are tripping a little bit, because this content is often served by secular people who are extremely uncomfortable with religion, and then so we keep losing users. So in your experiences, what kind of content is needed So what kind of lessons did you draw on what attracts people, what makes them stay, and who should deliver that content? Thank you.
Okay, of course. Just a second.
Gordon Georgiev, Forum for Reasonable Policy, Skopje. Let's just take for the sake of the argument that secularism is a political concept. It belongs to the realm of the politics. And then we have the faith on the other side, which is a, let's say, intimate concept which belongs to the realm of religion. There are some conservative, knowledgeable conservative people, especially in America, which claim that actually this relatively aggressive secularization of our societies, especially in the West, is making a bad, let's say, reward to the so-called traditional or old religions. In the sense that with this secularization, people naturally, we understand that they want to believe in something, especially in a world of uncertainty. And they will find ways to believe in something. Either these are radical offsprings of Islam or Christianity or anything, or some New Age religions. I'm just interested because it has some maybe tremendous petitions with the security. How do you assess this, let's say, conservative argument that actually the secularization, the very fast-paced secularization, actually is not very positive change in this religious context? I have no precise.
But you should pick two.
Well, okay, I'll pick the two Americans.
Okay, and Americans last. Then we will continue, but after these three. Okay.
Thank you. I am Dušan Ružić from the Faculty of Security Studies, and yes, and I must say to the colleague that posed the last question, people don't need to find anything to believe in. For example, I'm an atheist and I feel pretty comfortable about it, about my life, and I don't think that there is a reason or a need for religion to sort of evaluate your decisions and your choices in life. It's simply your consciousness, and it doesn't need to be based in religion. My question to all the speakers, because you're from different churches, different religions, should places of worship like mosques, churches, synagogues, and other places be monitored for security reasons? For example, we know from Serbia, the region of Sanjak, many young people were radicalized in the mosques. I know two people who were my associates who were radicalized in the mosques and went on jihad to fight for ISIS. So should these places be monitored, and if they should be, in which way?
Fine. Adnan, you could then two Americans, and then last questions for.
On the question of content and I would say messenger or whatever, it's hard to pinpoint. It's difficult for me to say who is a right messenger. It's much easier to say who is not the right messenger, and I can unequivocally tell you that government is not the right messenger. And other than that, you have a range of the content that we use is we have religious content that's done by mosques, made by mosques, what you would call moderate imams coming up with moderate interpretations of jihad. I'm not pulling punches here. I mean, I think it's important to, as civil society, to take a stand. And if someone asks a question and says, you know, does jihad mean I should go and blow something up? I think we can find an imam who says, no, it does not, and maybe you should put your energies into something else. To me, that is a perfectly fair thing for anyone in the non-government space to say, in part because of it's true, and in part because it's credible. We've also found, by the way, that former extremists, people who were in extremist organizations, are highly credible with the target audience. We've also found that there's actually not a lack of content. So when I say creating content, it's a very tiny portion of what our foundation does, because there's actually a lot of what's known as double-sided content, which wasn't necessarily created for the counter-narrative world, but is very applicable to the counter-narrative world. For example, there is a very famous show in the US called What Would You Do? It's kind of like a secret camera, and they put people in interesting situations, and then they play the camera back and see how people react. And one of the core narratives that we found that ISIS uses is to talk about the US military and the American people as being hostile to the religion of Islam, and therefore they should come and fight on behalf of the Islamic State in Syria or wherever they are. And there was a very interesting video, just very clear, it was a very interesting video that this TV show did many years ago about a US service member in a fast food restaurant who stood up for a person who turned out to be not Muslim at all, but looked Middle Eastern, but was being discriminated against by the attendant at the store. And it's just a simple visualization. It's a 2-minute video, but it has everything in it. It's got a US military service member who is standing up for someone who looks like a Muslim, whatever that means, and then it's got positive messages. It wasn't made for the purpose of countering ISIS, that video, but we're using it as part of one of our playlists when someone searches for U.S. military, jihad, all the wonderful search terms. So that's just one thing. I'm not trying to. We can go into a list of sort of the institutions who we use and the NGOs who we use who create this content, but the general idea is you use different messengers for different segments of what people are searching for, and whoever is credible in those spaces.
Elizabeth.
Okay, so about secular, then what is secular? I think, again, just sort of re-examining how we use the terms. That question about, a secular person providing content and a secular person may not be as comfortable as a religious person, I think is using the old categories that assume that there's secular and there's religious, and those are oppositional. And I think, again, we look around the world and there are a whole range of, arrangements between religion and state that we would characterize as secular, and they all look very different. And in an ideal world, I think those arrangements are malleable, they're adaptable, and they change over time in response to social, political, and economic conditions. So I would just caution us, again, in thinking about using those terms to say, okay, there are the secular people and the religious people. I think that's not necessarily the most useful way for us to think about things. And whether people need to believe in things or not, you could believe in no God, you could believe in some God, you could believe in the, invisible hand of the marketplace, that we all seem to take this metaphysical notion and think that that's no less bizarre than believing in God or no God. So I think, I can't answer psychologically or anthropologically. There are so many studies that show there is a need to believe in something. And then finally, regarding your question about should religious sites be monitored, that's an unbelievably complicated question. So my very simplistic answer is it depends. It depends on time, it depends on circumstance. We could have been asking the same question in the 1970s and 80s in Europe about whether or not, anarchist or, left-wing, places of assembly should be monitored, and intel collected. So, I guess it all depends,
Robbie, should you be monitored while you are preaching or not?
Well, no, the sermons would put people to sleep, probably. I've always been very uncomfortable with the idea of surveillance and monitoring. So generally I would say, no, I don't think they should, unless there is very specific reason. On the other hand, I think you also have to say if monitoring is going to happen, then it has to be monitoring of all religious sites. It would not be acceptable for example, only mosques to be monitored and not churches. I think there has to be absolute parity. If that does happen, I would very strongly say it shouldn't happen, but if it does, it has to be completely equal.
Just very quickly, it's far more effective, in my experience, to build community relationships and let the community check in on their mosques. I grew up in a small town in Florida, and I recently went there this summer. After 15 years, I went down there, and the little mosque that I used to go to with my brother and my dad and my mom, there's a wonderful little story there where they felt, and it's a tiny little mosque, tiny town, but it was not extremist, still is not extremist, but there's a wonderful story where someone told me that there was a period where one of the imams who was at the mosque started really saying things that were very bad, and it was the community that intervened and removed that imam and put in someone else. Happy, moving right along, and it's I think that should be the goal. That should be how we should approach a problem, not from a how do we put bugs in a religious house. I'm super uncomfortable with any house of worship.
So, are you monitoring something or not yet?
We're not really monitoring services. So yeah, let me answer your question about monitoring worship services. So from more academic and even statistical perspective, so I recently published an article in the Politics and Religion, and this is about the relationship between the religious war and the level of religious restriction. And this monitoring is one example of religious restriction. When some political elites perceive religion as a potential threat to their rule, they start to impose some level of a religious restriction, like monitoring services and also preventing religious leaders from participating in political activities or prohibiting religious political parties, something like that. But here, the interesting relationship is this is inverted U-shaped relationship. It's very statistically strong. So that is, when there's very harsh repression, there's peace. And also there is complete religious freedom, there's also peace as well. However, the moderate level of restriction, like somehow monitoring services and prohibiting religious political parties, but somehow allow participation of religious leaders, like religious speech, that is most destabilizing in terms of religious some security. So I found some such kind of example in Eritrea and also Myanmar. So I think starting to impose some kind of restriction can be highly destabilizing factor, especially in non-democratic parts of the world.
Remzi, you're monitoring.
I am monitoring media, not churches and mosques. And monitoring media in Albania, our findings support very much what Adnan was saying, that the bad internet cannot be fought with good internet. It's too late. We need to go to education. And Albanian government is doing one good thing. They don't do many good things, but they are doing one good thing, which is introducing not religious education at school, but knowledge on religion.
Right.
That religious literacy, you call it better. I think this has to be done. As for the media, I think the real stories are what really can work. Recently, we had 2 stories in Albanian media from former jihadists who came back, and they told the whole story, which is horrible. I think this is more convincing than any government program, any propaganda we can do. But also, can be nice stories that, again, when Pope was in Albania, a journalist decided, it was spread the news that Pope is under threat. It's always fake news. And there is also, might be always something true behind that, but then a journalist wrote a story of the Pope's visit in Albania. 500,000 people were in the street. 500,000 is the total number of Catholics in all Albania, which means you were received by all faiths of Albania. And Pope, during his visit, blessed few kids on his, and then journalists went and asked the families about, you met Pope blessed your child, and one here and one there, around 5 or 6, and the journalist interviewed 3 or 4 of them, and none of them was Catholic actually. And this was a very good story on what we live in Albania, that Pope was received by Albanian people, not only by Albanian Catholics. And I think building real stories from media can, because things in the end are quite local. Radicalization is local. It's not very much.
Yeah, just one last follow-up. I think your point, your question, gets to the heart of so much of what we're talking about. And I agree completely with my colleagues. No monitoring. When I was trying to say sometimes depends, and then introduced anarchists or left-wing radicals or who's ever identified as a radical, would we have asked those same questions if we were talking about the 1980s? And I think we need to get to the point where we demystify religion and think about religion in a far more multidimensional way. And all of the data show that where there are high levels of freedom of conscience, belief, and religion, and again, not necessarily religion, but conscious belief and religion, we see, and that means high levels of assembly, high levels of free speech, high levels of protection of property rights. We see very stable security environments. And the kind of monitoring and intelligence that is part of the securitization of religion today is producing exactly the opposite effect. And so I think that's something the data really show and we need to take seriously.
Great. We have 15 more minutes, so next round of questions, comments from the audience. Please, then.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to raise one question. So briefly, I was outside, so I didn't follow quite closely the Q&A sessions, but listening to the comments to the question about the monitoring website and so on. So I think it's not anymore taboo, if I understand correctly, the Elizabeth, that we use more proactively or more wisely the kind of the discussing the nexus between religion and politics and security. So not only taking care of the responding or the monitoring, or in a good sense, even the kind of the vicious or the very violent messages or the contents in website, we should send more the counter narrative against the kind of the vicious messages done by the terrorist groups and the extremist groups. So if I understand correctly, still in relation to the work by the Adnan, so US government, Obama administration, they did counter-violent extremism the initiative, the making the counter narrative, the messages on website and so on. So maybe we can discuss, I want to hear more about the using more sending more positive image, positive messages through website, which has vast potential. Thank you.
Please, microphone over there.
Thank you. My name is Irina Sahakian-Vetter. I'm from the Council of Europe, and I just wanted to thank you very much for a very interesting panel today. And so question of terrorism, of course, came up a couple of times, and you talked about recruitment online and in sometimes in places of worship. But I just wanted to ask about radicalization in prisons, and whether you could comment on that, and whether you have any thoughts on how to prevent that at a national level, global level, and in general at a level of just a citizen. Thank you.
So one more question, please.
Me again. So the question is for Mr. Jin Choi. You said, you asked the question how to make religion less useful to leaders. Did you mean political leaders or religious leaders? Political leaders. So could you please maybe explain or perhaps give an answer to this question, because as we all know, religion and ethnicity is one of the best ways to radicalize someone, to make the group feel vulnerable. Thank you.
Thanks. So let's start with this content that Ambassador was asking.
Sure, and thank you for that question, Mr. Ambassador. On websites, you know, if we can take one quick step backwards, and having served in 2 administrations in the U.S. and watching how the learning curve for both of them has happened, I think it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about websites and content and credible messengers and all of this, this is a fairly recent sort of development, evolution. I like to use the word evolution, and because it is an evolution. There was a time when, you know, we were dropping, the U.S. was dropping candy bars and teddy bears with positive messages for Afghan children, and that was considered. I am not discrediting that or anything, but that was considered at the time the right thing to do, and by people who were very committed to doing the right thing. Not that there was some evil intent behind it, but that was the sense. They hate us, so we should make them like us, and hearts and minds. And from there we learned that actually there's this whole very sophisticated system. We thought at one point all radicalization was happening in madrasas and in mosques, and that has proven, that has evolved. We've evolved out of that. We have learned that not all radicalization is happening there. Now then we learned that's happening a lot online, and that brings us to your question about websites. And initially we thought, let's just create more websites. So, you know, Al-Qaeda's media arms were very good at creating websites and creating places for people to go to extract information. And we thought, let's just counter it. Let's just overwhelm and create more websites, and then that way we'll have more information out there for people to go and get. Websites are not the focus. The focus today is what I was describing earlier. It's more the push factor. It's more, you know, not just sitting there with information, but really aggressively targeting that information to the right eyeball. So the right information to the right eyes. And so it's not about creating 50 different websites that will reach 100 million people. We don't care about 100 million people, and we don't care about 1 billion people. What we care about is that needle in a haystack, that one person or those 10 people in whatever community, and then understanding that profile and understanding what that means. And that plays into the whole larger conversation of not demonizing an entire religion, not demonizing an entire system, because that just creates all kinds of other problems. So that is to say, the website is really what we're looking at is the most evolved approach currently. Now, a year from now, it may be even more evolved, and we may have another conversation, and I think we should have an annual conversation about this, but right now, it's the push factor. That's one. And I just want to comment just very quickly on your question about gang radicalization. There is, it's an issue that I think a lot of people, a lot of governments are seized with, but there's not a lot of solution sets being applied. I do know that the Los Angeles LAPD and the New York police departments are working with their correctional departments in those states to try and understand this. Now, part of it is sort of group behavior within the prison system. We have at least in the, to talk about the U.S. system, we have a lot of issues with how prisons are managed in the U.S., and a lot of them are not managed very well. And so there's sort of a complicated, multifaceted issue. But what we found is when an ISIS collaborator or an Al-Qaeda sympathizer goes into a prison system, there's a very high chance that the populations that they mix with are then further radicalized. And that I think we're just now starting to uncover. There's no answer to it right now, but I think we are just starting to uncover what those links are and how they become a destabilizing factor in the prison system. And then when they're out, it becomes an even larger issue. So that's to say, I have no answer for your question, but it is definitely a big issue.
Yes. Anybody want to add to this prison-specific question? Do you go to prison as pastor?
I don't. I have visited one of the prisons here in Belgrade, and there is an Orthodox priest who is developing prison chaplaincy and doing very great work, I think, here in Belgrade. He's very embattled and isolated, but he's working very hard. I honestly, I have very little experience of prison ministry, prison chaplaincy, and I think I would agree with Adnan that it's potentially a huge problem, and it's potentially something that nobody really has any idea how to solve it at the moment. I think it's one of those situations that it requires further study.
Between the U.S. and Europe, the U.S. system is very aggressive about if you flirt with ISIS, I'll just use the word flirt. If you brush up against ISIS, you're probably going to be put in prison for a very long time. And it's just this is just the mode that the US law enforcement system is in. It's a very aggressive period. And that has its own problem, because once you lock someone away for 20 years or 15 years, they're then further building their credentials and spreading that. So it is a potentially huge problem.
Question.
Yeah.
If you could clarify.
I have two different versions in my answer. The one version is, as a scholar with no relationship with the politics. So definitely we need a democracy where the selection of the leaders depends on the support of broader population. So in this case, it's really hard for leaders to rely on religious appeal, which is exclusive. And they just don't need to exclude some groups of people, because they need larger support and votes, right? And also another is inclusive governance. So we need inclusive governance where different religious groups can equally participate in the cabinet and the decision-making process. So if you Google inclusive governance and Arasat, then you will find just a bunch of UN reports and newspaper articles that they require and that ask inclusive governance to al-Assad, the president of Syria. But second version of answer is as a perspective of leaders in those countries. And there is a clear dilemma, and they face clear dilemma, because in my dissertation, I analyzed the relationship between the probability of coup d'etat and inclusive governance. And I found that promoting inclusive governance in non-democracy significantly increased the probability of a coup d'etat. And that's why al-Assad is so difficult to include those Sunni Muslims in his government. And also to consider the example of Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Myanmar today. She is heavily criticized by international media for not protecting Rohingya Muslims, right? So I recently watched CNN news, and they say that Aung San Suu Kyi should be courageous enough to promote those Rohingya Muslims in inclusive governance, providing equal citizenship and political rights to those Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. However, in Myanmar, there's a delicate balance of power between the military and the Aung San Suu Kyi, and military still has a significant levels of power, naturally occupying at least one third of the National Assembly in Myanmar. And the problem is the military is gaining some kind of benefit from this problem in the Rakhine State, because the people, the Buddhist majority, now begin to rely on the military for their own security and the protection. So Aung San Suu Kyi has a dilemma. Promoting inclusive governance perhaps can increase probability of potential coup d'etat. And in this case, she can be praised by international media. However, if she promotes inclusive governance, if to maintain the current some repression, then she will be heavily criticized by international media, right? So this is a dilemma, and what would you do if you are in the position of Aung San Suu Kyi? That's my second version of the question.
So we are coming to the end, because Serbs love to serve lunch at 3 p.m. and I do not want to keep you from having this lunch, but I have one quick, they are unprepared totally, for next Belgrade Security Forum, and you shouldn't think you should just shoot from the hip, okay? Imagine that Belgrade Security Forum will say, okay, these guys did quite fine, so next year we need to have some keynote speaker who is from religious, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, or Hindu, whatever, you have one name to say to Sonia Licht, you should approach this person, he or she, to come and give public address, role of religion in making the world a better place to live. We will start with Father.
Oh, thank you.
Who that person is?
That is a very good question.
I know.
Thank you for that, putting me at the top of the list for a change. Who would I invite? I honestly don't know. I would say it should probably be a three-headed beast, have people from different religions. I think it would be impossible to choose one person from one religion to address this issue. And if I think of any names, I will come back to you at the end of the row.
I would say, right off the top of my head, someone like Lani Ali, Muhammad Ali's widow, just because she is a Muslim, she is a leader, she is an wonderful example, and I think a role model, and I think that's the kind of messaging you want to put out there.
Dalai Lama or somebody else?
Dalai Lama.
Dalai Lama, you would be okay with him?
Yeah, I'll be okay with him. Yeah.
So we have Dalai Lama, Elizabeth.
I agree with Father. I think it's difficult to pick, but if I'm forced to suggest,
You are forced.
okay, so I would suggest somebody like Archbishop Anastasios of Albania. He has lived in Kenya and understands the connection between faith and development, and I think that's something that is very important. We've been sort of touching on it, and also he has worked in a previously atheist environment and has a very good relationship with all of the multiple faith communities in that space.
Since Elizabeth actually
Your name?
gave my I fully subscribe to
I
Anastasios, who
stole your
is
choice.
a great illuminist of our time, I think. I have a name, which is Desmond Tutu.
Yeah.
We were in South Africa in a big media gathering, and he came and delivered a speech. And he wanted to give us a message against media arrogance, and then he told the story. He said, I was a child, and I was very much debating with my father, and I was, almost crying, and my father told me, he said, don't raise your voice, improve your arguments.
Would you go with Desmond Tutu? He's
I would go,
Anglican.
yes. I would
He's
go
Anglican.
with
Okay, so we have
I had actually
consensus.
come up with that name before you said it.
So we have both.
We have consensus between atheist, Muslim, Catholic, Orthodox, Remzi, and Anglican. Dalai Lama, we are fine, and if I may, I would.
as well, sorry.
Okay, and if I may, I would propose Pope Francis as Catholic moderator. So we have. So if you would agree with this, and with Pope, he has enormous sense of humor. EU had summit of 60th anniversary of EU. And there was this dilemma. Heads of state were going to Rome because Treaty of Rome is founding document. So all 28 leaders went to Rome, and they were thinking what to do night before summit starts. And somebody proposed, why don't they meet with Pope Francis? But not all of them were religious, not all of them were Catholic, sort of EU is very colorful, but they ended up there, and Francis with his team did incredible thing. You know that they had family photo. Pope Francis in his white, and all these leaders in dark suits, and ladies also were sort of Angela Merkel in sort of going to 16th Chapel, they dressed sort of properly. And Pope Francis took them and had family photo. He was in the middle and all of them around him. And the Last Judgment by Michelangelo painting. You can Google it. That painting was fantastic. So I would propose this guy, and all others which you propose are just brilliant. And next year, when Belgrade Security Forum will prepare educational material, religious minimum for participant of Belgrade Security Forum, we should also consider inviting some of these. Thank you very much for participating, and thank you for excellent panel.